Welcome to the STEM Talk podcast, your 30-minute monthly STEM pulse check. Hosted by the After School STEM Hub, STEM Education Coalition, and STEM Ecosystems by TIES. The STEM Talk podcast creates a safe space for dialogue while maintaining a focus on information that matters to you and the communities you serve. In just 30 minutes each month, join our experts from across the STEM landscape as they provide factual information, practical strategies, and actionable resources to help you navigate the ever-changing world of STEM education, workforce development, policy, and advocacy.
Welcome to the STEM Talk, where we explore the issues, innovations, and big ideas shaping STEM. Hi, I'm Jenny Frank, and I'm the director of the STEM Ecosystem Initiative here at TIES. And today, we're diving into a really important topic that affects every single STEM program. Episode 6, Where is the Money? Are you curious about where federal STEM's funding is headed? Well, this episode breaks down the congressional budget process and highlights key funding opportunities across research, education, and innovation programs for the fiscal year of 2026. Let's welcome back our expert guests. Della Cronin is the principal at Bose Public Affairs Group with over 20 years of experience in education and research policy. She's organized Capitol Hill advocacy efforts, worked with the Department of Education on policy implementation, and is a recognized voice on federal education policy. James Brown is Executive Director of the STEM Education Coalition. A nuclear engineer by training, his unique path includes engineer work, Capitol Hill legislative experience, and advocacy leadership at the American Chemical Society. He brings both technical expertise and political insight into the STEM advocacy conversation. We also have Leslie Brooks, who is the STEM manager at the After School Alliance, where she leads up the After School STEM Hub, a coalition working to advance federal investment in after school STEM. Welcome, everyone, and let's get started.
Hi, everybody. It's nice to be with you again. James and I are going to refresh your memories on where we were before Congress left in August and what is now become sort of the busy time for appropriation season, which has now become the last quarter of the year, and where some bills that are important to STEM education and its advocates are and might be going. So let's get going. Just at the very end of August, as a reminder, the Senate acted on a couple of bills that are important to us. The FY26 Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education Bill, which funds the Departments of Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education, but also NIH, some other things, some other research interests that are important to the research enterprise and STEM education interests as well. The Senate acted in a bipartisan way. Before they left town, they level funded most K-12 education programs. There are a couple pluses and minuses here and there, but overall it was pretty much the same level of funding as we're currently seeing, including for the 21st Century Community Learning Center program, which of course is important to after school and STEM, and Title IV Part A, which is where STEM education, local STEM education investments sort of live. On the Commerce, Justice, Science front, the bill that the Senate passed in a bipartisan way firmly rejects the White House plan to sort of gut the National Science Foundation. If you'll recall, earlier in the year, the Trump administration had proposed cutting the foundation by half. It does not do that. It also supports the preservation of the STEM Education Directorate. And there's report language in there that firmly takes aim at some of the things the Trump administration has been doing this year, to assert the importance of broadening participation investments there. There's also some report language that calls out the importance of various discrete programs. Another thing that happened in August that was important to the STEM education and after school folks is that the AmeriCorps funds that were being withheld from lots of different programs and states was released. The White House formally announced the AI challenge via the Office of the First Lady. She is being tapped to be sort of the White House face of this effort. And then the National Science Foundation released a bunch of STEM and AI solicitations trying to get some money out the door to support both of those endeavors. We'll talk a little bit more in depth about that. This is a reminder of time and its progression and how very little time is left on the congressional calendar, certainly between now and the end of the fiscal year, which is September 30th, with Congress being out the week of the 21st. That doesn't give them a lot of time to pass the appropriations bills to keep the government funding past October 1st. So what will they do between now and then is an open question. And then they will spend probably the remainder of the year also talking about spending bills to fund the agencies and programs that we care about. All right, James.
Well, so not to cut short our time here, but if there was one slide you were going to take away a message from this conversation, it's this one right here, which is, the Trump administration came into office with what they consider to be a big mandate to cut federal spending. A lot of that landed on the National Science Foundation, the Department of Education. So they proposed big cuts to those agencies. The House of Representatives, which is elected every 2 years and tends to, is in Republican control, tends to follow their president, has approved many of those cuts. The United States Senate, which was designed to moderate democracy and slow things down when there's radical change, decided not to take any of those cuts for the National Science Foundation or the Department of Education writ large. We're going to go through what that means, but this is sort of like the Constitution operating the way it was envisioned, which is big changes require lots of time and deliberation and consideration, and we're sort of starting to see that play out. This is the first, frankly, good news we've had on the spending front from the perspective of our priorities, caring about the STEM missions at the Department of Ed and at the National Science Foundation. What we're going to do is cover that in a little bit more depth. So the next couple slides are going to go through the education spending bill. So this is, just the top lines for those bills. And the bottom line here is the Senate basically keeps funding at the same level for the next fiscal year as they had for last year. They've maintained small increases for some of the key programs like Title I, whereas the House bill is proposing cuts that either go as far as the administration on most programs or almost as far as the administration on programs across the Department of Education. This is the bill that covers the Department of Education. So you can see here the bottom line. The Senate has protected the role of the Department of Education, and in spending bills where you have to get 60 votes to pass a spending bill, that this sort of bipartisan agreement in the Senate really does matter when it comes to determining what's going to happen in future spending opportunities. So that is a big dispositive result for the Department of Education and the political process that we can talk a little bit more about. So this is an example of going through some of the details. So Title I got a slight increase in the Senate bill, whereas there were cuts proposed by the House and by the administration. Title II got level funded in the Senate bill at $2.2 billion. The other two bills would propose eliminating it. This is a point of agreement between the House and Senate. They both continued funding Title IV Part A at about the same level. That's as Della mentioned, the program that used to include the Math and Science Partnership Program and a variety of other funding streams of the Department of Education in both bills. This is a really big deal. And they also continued funding the 21st Century Community Learning Center program. It's in the Senate bill, it's in the House bill. And to the point that we made last time, the really big grassroots surge of support for this program is part of the reason why it's reflected in both bills. The House could have zeroed that out for spite, and they didn't. And then, some of the other programs in this piece of legislation, career and technical education, present in both bills, got support in the House bill and, level funding in the Senate bill. Pell Grants are still in the Senate bill. The House had level funding for them. Senate had a slight increase in the maximum amount of award. Federal work study, again, supported in the Senate bill, not in the House bill. TRIO, the Senate continued funding for it. The House also agreed with that. Head Start, a small increase in the Senate piece of legislation. Community development block grants, also some support in the Senate. And this is frankly the first good news we've told anybody around spending in a while. And, in an environment where flat is the new up, we're really, really flat or slightly up, which is really a good sign for going into the end of the year, because one of two things will happen at the end of the year. They're either going to pass a spending bill that enacts something like the amounts that we see on this screen weighted towards the Senate on these programs, or we're going to see a continuing resolution that actually continues the funding levels at the same program levels across the board. So they've set the table as being at least as much money next year, or maybe slightly less, slightly more than the money that was available this year in spending, which going into the news we've been talking about for the last 6 months is a big deal. So, this is just again talking about some of the programs that are in danger. Title II is probably where I think, the teacher professional development money is the one where I think is probably the biggest danger of getting a cut in the end of the year spending bill, because the Senate probably can't carry all the water on that. Here's, some other things that are in there: state assessments, full communities, school. So first service community schools, both cut. Promised neighborhoods, there's probably some promised neighborhoods grantees on here. Also, at risk. But the takeaway here is just the bipartisan protection of science and STEM education, the Senate bill. The White House is going to be quite frustrated with the lack of movement in the Senate on some of their priorities. And the bottom line for us, just to go back one slide, the bottom line for us as a coalition, we're working on a broad multi-sign-on letter that's going to thank the Senate for its support for these programs. That's our recommendation to others who are doing things. Is in an environment where there's a lot of partisanship, a lot of negativity, being able to say thank you for something is a big part of the message. So if you're going to do one thing, it's to thank your senators for having an appropriations process that yielded a result that most senators can stand behind. So let me hand this one off to you, Della.
Sure. So let's dig a little bit deeper on what's going on in the Commerce, Justice, Science Appropriations Bill. Good. It's similar to the discussion around the labor H1. Good news in the Senate, less good news in the House. So in the Senate bill, the foundation would be funded at $9 billion, a 0.7% cut versus last year. In this day and age, that is good news for the foundation and its programs. Research and related activities would be level funded. Somebody else can remember what MREFC stands for, but would get a 50% increase. And then STEM education would be preserved. And it's important, we've said it already, important to say that a bipartisan bill that came out of the Senate argues for the preservation of the STEM Education Directorate, which is something that, of course, the STEM education community is glad to see and is different from the House bill, which would eliminate that directorate altogether and roll those functions into the research and related agencies. Activities, I'm sorry. The Trump budget request earlier this year would have been similar to the House bill. Thank you, Anita. The Trump request would have eliminated the STEM Education Directorate altogether. And then we all know that it would have proposed severe cuts across all accounts, really focusing on AI and quantum to the detriment of just about everything else, including social and behavioral sciences and the elimination of investments in those endeavors.
The major research equipment matters if you're going to Antarctica or you have a giant telescope or some other giant facility that's funded by the national state. It's all the really expensive toys.
And this slide just sort of gives you more detail on some of the proposals that we've mentioned. The previous one outlining what the Senate bill says, what the House bill says, and what President Trump would have liked to have seen. And where we are now, which is, of course, somewhere in the middle, and leaves us as advocates to argue for the higher numbers as this process goes forward.
Well, and one thing I'll add, Della, is, the new money for major research and equipment, that $350 million was the money that was in the STEM Education Directorate. And I think that's a kind of a clever trick by the Senate to keep the money in the bill and preserve the option of balancing that back, because I don't actually know there's enough Antarctic icebreakers to buy with the $350 million. So that's sort of a clever way of giving the administration a little bit of a move in that direction when maybe they didn't need to.
All right. I'll hand it back to you, James.
Yeah, so some other important things that were called out by the United States Senate, when they go through the appropriations process, they have a bill that sets up all the spending levels for all the agencies that get federal appropriations. And then after the full committee, meaning that, they have a commerce subcommittee, they have a markup, they vote on it, they make changes, and they have a report that comes out that shows you what their intention was for each of these programs. So this is their commentary on policy. And these Senate report bullets here are really important because they called out social, behavioral, and economic sciences. They talked about maintaining some of NSF's databases on workforce research and cybersecurity. They called out the importance of artificial intelligence. They mentioned a number of education programs. So they called out informal STEM learning, the Noyce Teacher Scholarship Program. There was a long section in there affirming the mission of NSF is to broaden participation in the STEM fields and distinguish that from diversity, equity, and inclusion activities by saying that's statutorily authorized to support broadening participation. And the House bill actually had language, in the other direction, saying that there could be no funds spent on anything related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So big statements by the Senate of reaffirming some of the statutory missions they have given NSF over a period of time. So this is, if you sense any glee in my voice, it's because this is way more than we were expecting going into this process. They didn't have to add this additional language speaking with enthusiasm about these, and that sort of speaks to the annoyance of members of the Senate seeing the administration go further than their mandate by laying off such large numbers of employees and moving in other agencies to NSF's office space. At some point, even if you're in full agreement with the administration, but you're the authorizing committee for those agencies, what this says to me is, hey, that's our purview to decide how the agency, what its outer boundaries are in terms of how it's managed, and you've overstepped those bounds. So a couple of takeaways for this. It's really important for people to see that the Senate sustained NSF's core mission, didn't go along with some of the really damaging cuts. And at the end of the day, similar to what I mentioned about the education department, saying thank you is an outdated skill in DC in the sense that people have lost a little hope maybe in saying thank you when good things happen. But I think it's well worth us as a community to make sure we say thank you to our representatives in the Senate in particular for the actions they've taken on behalf of these two agencies.
All right, thanks so much, James and Della. Hey everyone, I'm Leslie Brooks and I'm the STEM manager at the After School Alliance. I wanted to briefly also highlight a few key federally funded programs that we advocate for as they either directly or indirectly support after school STEM. So program funding, after school research funding, curricular support, and partnerships are all supported through a variety of federal agencies. The National Science Foundation, NASA, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, also known as NOAA, are all funded through that CJS or Commerce Justice Science funding bill that James and Della mentioned. So NSF's Directorate for STEM Education supports STEM education and after school, such as through the Advancing Informal STEM Learning Program, also known as ASIL. NASA's Office of STEM Engagement funds and supports after school and informal STEM learning opportunities, such as through their Next Gen STEM program. And they have direct partnerships also with 21st Century Community Learning Centers. And then NOAA's Office of Education supports K-12 environmental education through community-based organizations, and a couple of these key programs that they fund are the Bay Watershed Education and Training Program, which also partners with 21st Century Community Learning Centers, and the Environmental Literacy Program. So for all of these key offices and programs, the White House's proposed 26 budget seeks to eliminate them. Back in Congress, the House's proposal defunds NSF's ASIL program and NASA's Office of STEM Engagement, but does keep funding for NOAA's Office of Education, although decreasing it overall. But they do preserve funding for that BWET program I mentioned at the same levels as in 2025. And then meanwhile, the Senate's funding proposal maintains all these programs and increasing funding slightly for educational programs at NASA. And also a positive thing to note that James already mentioned, but I just want to highlight, is in the Senate's report language that accompanies the appropriations bill, it includes strong support for after-school programs and after-school educators, encouraging the National Science Foundation to bridge connections between STEM education researchers and after-school programs to enhance their partnerships so they can have long-term sustainability plans to support these programs. And then, where the opportunities do tend to lie right now that, that we might want to leverage is in AI and quantum information science. So, just thinking about how we can integrate these themes into the great work that programs are already doing. As it was already mentioned, the National Science Foundation is releasing supplemental funding for current awardees, also specifically in support of the Presidential AI Challenge, and they encourage community partnerships. So these could be opportunities for after-school programs to partner. And then recently, America's Talent Strategy was released, which lays out a plan to invest in AI and cybersecurity workforce through education initiatives. And then also the Labor, Health and Human Services, Education and Related Agencies Appropriations Bill also supports funding and partnerships for after-school STEM through a variety of different programs, only some of which I've highlighted here. And since James and Della already went through a lot of the funding levels that are proposed, I just wanted to highlight a few areas you might not be aware of. So the Federal Work Study Program can help support college students working in after school and other community-based organizations while they attend college. And for STEM programs, this is great because students who are majoring in STEM degrees can serve as near-peer mentors for youth and after-school programs, and also gain those experience in teaching scientific concepts to younger audiences. And then through the Department of Labor, there's the Career Pathways for Youth program, which is funded through the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And it supports national after-school and out-of-school time organizations that place an emphasis on workforce readiness programming to expand job training and workforce pathways for youth. The Senate does maintain funding for this, the same as the 2025 levels at $20 million. And then we'll see what the House proposes for it when their report language is released, hopefully next week. And then finally, in the related agencies part of this funding bill, we have the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which definitely support after-school STEM programming throughout the nation. Unfortunately, while the Senate and House both propose to preserve this entity, they do both try to decrease funding by $3 million, unfortunately. And then the Corporation for National and Community Service, that's the one that supports AmeriCorps programs. And AmeriCorps members provide academic support to students and lead STEM activities in after-school and summer learning programs. So they're very key to supporting the workforce of after-school programs and STEM learning. And the Senate maintains funding at the same level while the House cuts funding, but does preserve it. But also, as the graph over to the right indicates, the down arrow, even though the Senate's proposals freeze funding for many of these programs at the same levels as last year, these are still essentially cuts due to inflation and the increased costs of running programs. And the levels that we had last year for most of these programs are the same as they were for 2024 and 2023. So even though we're talking about wins, we still have a lot of advocacy work to do, which leads us to we want to end on a call to action. So there's still time for all of us to reach out to our elected officials in both the House and the Senate and to share this information with our family, friends, and colleagues, to also reach out to Congress to let them know that our youth and communities want and need sustained funding for STEM education. And then with that, I'm going to stop sharing so that we can go to the question and answer section and start off with one question for the panelists, and then I'll look and see if there were any questions added throughout our presentation. So James and Della and Anita, Jenny, who are some of the most overlooked allies you can think of?
So I guess, folks on, I would say that, we're in that weird spot where everybody supports education, and most of the disagreements that we have at the federal level are about who should pay for what and how much. So I would say that just about every elected official is an advocate for education. And I would urge those on the call, since this is one about taking action in support of things that are important to you and the folks that you work with and for, I would urge everyone to figure out what it is that their elected officials at every level care about in education and connect with them on what they prioritize. And I think that as educators and folks who care about education, we've all become very adept at meeting folks where they are. And that applies in advocacy and talking to lawmakers just as much as it does in being in classrooms and other educational programs.
And I'll add to that I think parents are often an overlooked constituency in terms of advocacy. I think that parents care deeply about what happens in their children's school and after school programs. And I think that when they raise up their voices, they're really effective. And the other thing I'll just post is, the After School Alliance runs a grassroots celebration of after school programs called Lights on After School. This is the 26th year coming up at the end of October. And I think I've said this in many different episodes, but I think there's nothing like showing lawmakers, parents, community, the media, what is actually happening in the programs that you run. And so I think hosting a public event and inviting people in to see what is actually happening changes hearts and minds in ways that no amount of talking can, or rather, it's more effective than talking at people and describing what you're doing. Show them what you're doing, and that really changes people's minds.
And I'll amplify what Anita said. We talked about it briefly in the call, but I do think that the voices of parents were instrumental in preliminarily releasing the funds of 21st Century Community Learning Center programs earlier this summer. But then ultimately the release of $7 billion in education funding, it was a tremendous advocacy effort, and one that was the parents' voice were crucial in.
All right. And then is the National Science Foundation, and they wrote DOE, but I'm wondering if it's supposed to indicate Department of Education. Is funding for those likely to be targeted by the rescission efforts that some are threatening to use to go around Senate negotiations?
Good question. And my prediction skills get more diminished by the day, but I would say that the rescission effort that we saw unveiled last week, which was more about the State Department and other program funds, I think that the fate of that effort will inform future efforts. I think that this White House is very much trying to assert its authority, or what it considers to be its authority on the spending process, and they're trying different approaches to that. I do think there could be an education rescission effort in the fall. I'm not sure that the National Science Foundation would suffer the same fate, but who knows at this point. I would say that, but this White House has certainly been critical of the Department of Education, certainly would like to see that agency go away. So it would make sense that if they are feeling emboldened, or if they are successful in some of these efforts, they might go after that agency.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. In your opinion, why should folks keep applying for NSF funding if there's uncertainty with everything going on and funding being taken away, given back? What is your opinion on that?
I think Anita can take it. Anita and I have talked about that. I think Anita can answer that one.
Oh, I don't know. I think that demonstrating demand is always important, because I think if you don't ask people, lawmakers will assume that there's no need for it, and it's a guaranteed way of making sure it goes away because you show that you're not missing it. I do recognize, having just written a couple of NSF proposals, how onerous they are and how much work it is. So I think the more collaborative that you can be and write it with a group of others to sort of lighten the load, all of that in these times when the funding outlook is so uncertain, to reduce the burden on yourself, because I do know that it takes a lot of time and effort to write these proposals.
Thank you for
But
joining
we are
us for this
guaranteed to have
insightful
them go
discussion
away
on the
if we
policy
never write
landscape
them.
affecting STEM education and workforce development.
All right, well,
We
thank
hope
you
you've
so much,
gained
everyone,
valuable
and thank you everyone for
perspectives and
joining
actionable
us. I will pass it
strategies
up to
from our
Jenny to close us
conversations.
out.
We'll continue this important dialogue with critical insights about top STEM priorities and more guidance on navigating the current advocacy landscape. To learn more about the work of STEM Education Coalition, After School STEM Hub, and STEM ecosystems, please visit our websites. Until next time, keep advocating for a strong STEM education and workforce nationwide.